Midway through 1943, at 25,000 feet over occupied Europe, a single B-17 flying fortress struggled to hold its place in the formation. One engine coughed unevenly, its propeller feathered, forcing the bomber to lag just enough to be noticed. Inside the fuselage, oxygen masks hissed with every breath. Frost crept along bare metal, numbing fingers despite thick gloves. Below, black flak bursts bloomed against the sky. Above and behind, dark specks grew larger as German fighters assembled for a methodical kill. Inside the aircraft, there was no speech about heroism. One man remained fixed at his station, eyes tracking angles and distances, hands wrapped around a control most Luftwaffe pilots still misunderstood. He was not thinking about medals or history. He was thinking about timing, approach paths, and the narrow margins separating survival from fire and falling metal. The stakes were merciless. Bomber losses that month bordered on catastrophic. Entire crews vanished between briefing and debriefing, leaving empty bunks and unanswered letters. German pilots had perfected frontal and coordinated attacks designed specifically to tear B-17 formations apart. A damaged fortress like this was expected to last minutes, not missions. But inside this bomber was a weapon the Germans didn't plan for, and in the moments ahead, their confidence would collapse. Before the war, he lived a life that would never make headlines. He worked with machines, learned their limits, and trusted patterns more than luck. Whether it was maintaining engines, hunting on weekends, or competing on local ranges, his skill was quiet and practical. He understood recoil, lead, and the way metal behaved under stress, not as theory, but as habit earned over years. That civilian experience shaped how he thought in the air. He saw angles where others saw chaos, timing where others felt panic. Machines to him were not mysterious or heroic. They were systems. If you respected their tolerances and understood their blind spots, they would do exactly what physics allowed. Nothing more, nothing less. The idea that would later be called a hidden weapon began as something almost embarrassing in its simplicity. It involved no new hardware, no special ammunition, and no official modification. It was merely a different way of using an internal gun position, a subtle shift in coordination between crewmen, and a sighting approach that looked unimpressive on training diagrams. On paper, it changed nothing. There was nothing legendary about the man himself. He was not an ace, not an officer with influence, not a name anyone outside his crew remembered. He followed orders, learned his aircraft, and noticed a flaw others had grown used to ignoring. When war came, that way of thinking collided head-on with military tradition. It would be tested under fire, pressure, disbelief, and consequences no classroom prepared him. The United States Air Forces in 1943 operated on precision, discipline, and doctrine. Every B-17 crew followed rigid roles. Pilots flew, navigators plotted, gunners fired, and engineers monitored instruments. Standard operating procedures were drilled relentlessly. Defensive firing arcs were prescribed, engagement windows timed, and maneuvers standardized to reduce chaos in formation. Deviations were discouraged, considered risky, even reckless. The fortress was treated as a machine to obey, not a tool to rethink. Into this environment came an idea that challenged the system. A subtle adjustment to internal coordination, a shift in gun timing, a minute change in firing angles, things that could increase defensive efficiency but violated every training manual in the book. Superiors and peers were swift in their reaction. "That's not how the fortress works," one instructor said flatly. "You'll jam the guns before you even get a shot," another warned. "Stick to your station," came the clipped admonishment from a flight leader. Laughter sometimes followed in mess halls when he quietly suggested minor changes, a mix of disbelief and derision. Logistical hurdles compounded the skepticism. There was no time to retrain crews, no official clearance to alter procedures, and mounting bomber losses meant innovation was considered too dangerous, not necessary. The system rewarded conformity, punished experimentation. Meanwhile, the Germans attacked with predictable precision, exploiting blind spots the manuals failed to acknowledge, patterns the protagonist had studied quietly for months. He saw openings where doctrine demanded repetition. He saw vulnerabilities others dismissed. And yet he persisted, not loudly, not confrontationally, but firmly. If the manuals were right, bombers wouldn't be falling from the sky. And he knew, deep inside the machine, that obedience alone would never be enough to survive. Over the skies of occupied Europe in mid-1943, the air war had evolved into a deadly calculus. German radar stations detected incoming formations hours before they reached the Reich, feeding coordinates to fighter bases along the flight path. Bf-109s and FW-190s took off in precise waves, climbing to intercept at optimal angles. Training emphasized predictable B-17 blind spots. Frontal attacks exploited the limited firing arcs of nose gunners, while overlapping waves concentrated fire on tail and waist positions. German pilots drilled relentlessly, learning timing, spacing, and formation density, turning the skies into a lethal chessboard. For American crews, the statistics were grim. Average loss rates for deep penetration missions hovered between 20 and 30%. More than a third of crews never returned from raids over Germany that spring. Survival was not merely a matter of skill or courage, it was a statistical improbability. Mission failure percentages soared when weather, flak, and fighter coordination intersected. Each bomber represented not just a plane, but the lives of 10 men, risking annihilation in predictable patterns honed by experience and doctrine. There was no room for error, no tolerance for improvisation beyond calculated margins. Yet into this well-oiled machine of attrition and precision flew one B-17, limping but intact, carrying a tactic unapproved, barely understood, and invisible to the enemy. A small adjustment in coordination, imperceptible to outsiders, would soon intersect with German assumptions in a way they had never anticipated. The battlefield was immense, the danger real, and the odds overwhelming. But within the confines of this fortress, a quiet defiance waited to rewrite the rules of engagement. The so-called hidden weapon was not a new gun or secret device. It was a method, born from observation and discipline, that exploited how the B-17's internal defenses truly overlapped when used as a single system rather than isolated positions. Standard doctrine treated each gunner as an individual node, responsible only for his assigned arc. The protagonist saw something else: geometry. German fighters relied on assumptions. They believed certain approach angles were effectively safe, moments where multiple B-17 guns could not bear simultaneously. Those assumptions were based on training manuals, not lived reality. By subtly adjusting internal coordination, the crew created overlapping cones of fire that existed only for seconds at a time, but seconds were enough. Timing mattered more than volume. Guns were not sprayed, they were held until fighters committed. Step by step, the solution unfolded. First came communication. Gunners synchronized visually and verbally, calling ranges and angles instead of reacting independently. Second came restraint. Rather than firing at maximum range, they waited, letting attackers close into zones where angles converged. Third came sequencing. As one gunner opened fire, another delayed by fractions of a second, forcing attacking pilots into evasive maneuvers that exposed them to a second stream they did not expect. The effect was similar to a chess trap, where a piece appears unguarded only because the opponent has not seen the board correctly. It also resembled ambush hunting, where patience and positioning matter more than speed. German pilots trained to attack decisively suddenly found themselves flying into intersecting fire from directions doctrine told them were impossible. This worked in the B-17 because of its design. The Fortress carried multiple internally connected gun positions, crewed closely enough to communicate instantly, mounted on a stable platform that absorbed recoil without violent yaw. Other aircraft lacked this combination of mass, redundancy, and crew density. What appeared clumsy on paper became lethal when treated as a coordinated organism. To the men who devised it, the elegance lay in its simplicity. Every movement respected physics, crew limits, and mechanical tolerances. There was no heroics, only discipline under pressure. It demanded trust between stations and the courage to wait. In that patience, the advantage was born. It transformed vulnerability into control at precisely the right moments. The moment arrived sooner than anyone expected. Over the Ruhr Valley, dark silhouettes of Bf-109s appeared against the pale sky, converging in the textbook patterns the protagonist had studied for months. Crew members cast nervous glances at one another, some skeptical, some quietly hopeful. Every eye followed the approaching fighters, every hand tensed on triggers, every mind aware that a single miscalculation could be fatal. Seconds stretched like hours as the first attackers entered the overlapping zones. Then, with precise restraint, gunners fired in a calculated sequence. One stream met the lead fighter, forcing it to roll wide. Another, milliseconds later, struck the pursuing wingman, breaking its formation. Angles collided in ways German pilots had never anticipated, exposing them to a cascade of fire from positions they assumed were safe. Evasive maneuvers became chaos, overlapping and contradicting, while the B-17 remained stable and coordinated. The first tangible results appeared almost immediately. One Bf-109 spiraled downward, smoking. Another barely cleared a collision course. Even more surprising were the aborted runs. Pilots veered off and regrouped, hesitating before the next wave. The crew, initially tense and doubtful, felt a quiet surge of vindication. By the time the formation passed, it was clear. This was no fluke. The method worked. The hidden weapon was real, effective, and repeatable. For the first time, the men inside the fortress glimpsed the power of disciplined ingenuity, a force that could bend the course of engagement without changing a single machine. The Germans were not slow to respond. Within days, intelligence reports indicated that B-17 crews had altered their defensive behavior. Fighter groups adjusted their approach angles, increasing speed, overlapping passes, and coordinating attacks in unprecedented waves. The Luftwaffe's aggression intensified, and the sky became a gauntlet of flak bursts and streaking FW-190s. Every mission now brought new hazards. Engines shook from near-miss shrapnel, oxygen levels fluctuated as panels cracked under pressure, and crew members endured the sharp sting of frostbite at 25,000 feet. The physical toll was relentless, yet the real challenge lay in maintaining mental focus under continuous threat. Each sortie tested the hidden weapon under stress. The protagonist adapted quickly. Communication became sharper and more concise. Gunners called ranges in shorthand, anticipating German maneuvers rather than reacting. Timing was adjusted in milliseconds, synchronized to the movement of enemy aircraft and the subtle drift of the formation. Every station moved as a unit, anticipating the next attack, while maintaining composure despite injuries and fatigue. Discipline was non-negotiable. A single misstep could undo the calculated arcs of fire. Sequence after sequence unfolded like a brutal lesson in mechanics and human endurance. German pilots, expecting the same responses, found themselves funneled into zones where overlapping fire forced evasive maneuvers they had not rehearsed.
Each engagement validated the method further, reinforcing the principle that predictability could be exploited without creating chaos within the B-17 itself. The crew respect for the protagonist grew quietly, a shared understanding that his adjustments were not experiments but essential survival tools. Still, the escalation continued. Flak gunners refined their patterns, and the Luftwaffe leaders sent more experienced pilots to confront the anomaly. The B-17 and its crew faced heavier opposition, yet the hidden weapon held. The adaptation was no longer theoretical, it was proven in repeated engagements. And in the distance, on the horizon of the next mission, there loomed
an engagement so decisive that it would force the Germans to finally take notice, recognizing for the first time that the rules they relied upon were no longer absolute. On that fateful mission, the results were undeniable. In less than 7 minutes of concentrated engagement, the B-17's coordinated internal fire forced 3 Bf-109s out of formation, damaged 2 more beyond immediate repair, and disrupted the attack runs of an entire fighter squadron. German pilots, trained to exploit blind spots and predictable arcs, found themselves repeatedly funneled into intersecting fire zones they had assumed were safe. Each maneuver the crew executed translated directly into calculated losses. Every shot was deliberate, every delay purposeful. The Luftwaffe's response dissolved into confusion as surviving fighters broke off to regroup, leaving the formation temporarily unmolested. Observers in other bombers recorded smoke trails and spiraling aircraft, confirming that the results were not coincidental but the direct consequence of the hidden tactic. For the first time, the crew witnessed proof that careful coordination, disciplined timing, and a deep understanding of their own machine could produce measurable, repeatable results. The payoff was clear. This was no accident, no fluke. It was cause and effect perfected under fire. When the mission concluded, the reactions were muted but telling. Crew members exchanged glances of disbelief, some still struggling to comprehend what had just unfolded. Official reports were filed with careful, clinical language, noting destroyed aircraft and disrupted attacks without dramatization. In mess halls and briefing rooms, the quiet acknowledgement of achievement replaced earlier ridicule. The laughter that had greeted the suggestion of this tactic was gone. Mockery evaporated, not with fanfare, but with the subtle, almost imperceptible shift of respect. Fellow crews began to adopt the technique in hushed practice sessions, testing coordination and timing without formal approval. Locally, the change was immediate. Enemy pilots hesitated on familiar attack vectors, forced to adjust their patterns, and sometimes abort missions entirely. The precision they had relied upon was undermined by a single, disciplined crew operating within a simple, overlooked framework. Institutional discomfort lingered among superiors who prided themselves on adherence to doctrine. If one crew could discover this advantage under strict regulations and severe consequences, how many others had been told not to try, discouraged from thinking beyond the manuals? The answer was uncomfortable and undeniable. And quietly, in that tension, the underdog had shifted the rules of engagement without a single official sanction. In the months following that pivotal engagement, the hidden weapon quietly spread through bomber formations. Crews observed the disciplined coordination and adapted it wherever possible, often without formal authorization. Official manuals never fully codified the method, yet its effectiveness could not be ignored. Training officers tolerated subtle demonstrations, and in practice, entire squadrons adopted variations of the timing and firing arcs. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, remained uncertain. Their assumptions about predictable B-17 behavior gradually eroded by the repeated, unanticipated resistance of these meticulously coordinated crews. The protagonist survived the war, his contributions largely uncelebrated outside the tight circle of his crew. He received a modest promotion but no public acclaim, returning home to an ordinary life while the innovation he had fostered quietly shaped countless missions. The aircraft itself, once battered, once underestimated, was dismantled after the war, leaving only reports and personal accounts to carry the story. Today, few historians emphasize the tactical nuance that allowed a single crew to alter engagement outcomes, and the principle remains largely hidden in technical manuals and after-action notes. It is a story of ingenuity exercised under impossible conditions, of disciplined thought against rigid authority, and of the subtle ways the underdog can change the course of events without fanfare. The tragedy lies in its obscurity, a method that saved lives, disrupted an enemy, and demanded extraordinary skill, yet lives on in fragments, remembered by those who value precision, patience, and the quiet power of human understanding over brute force. The story of this B-17 reminds us that wars are not won solely by machines, guns, or numbers, but by the minds and decisions of those who operate them. One crew, acting with observation, discipline, and a willingness to see patterns others ignored, transformed a fragile bomber into a decisive instrument of survival. Curiosity under pressure, combined with courage and meticulous understanding, proved more powerful than doctrine or reputation alone. It is a quiet testament to human ingenuity, a lesson in how careful thought can bend even the harshest realities of war. If you value uncovering stories like this, like this video to help rescue forgotten histories. Subscribe to join our mission of bringing overlooked acts of ingenuity to light. Share in the comments your location or a family military story. Be part of a community that honors those who dared to think differently, preserving their legacy for generations who must never forget.